everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Carol Becker, Dean of the School of the Arts. We're thrilled, totally thrilled to have Ann Hamilton here. We are. So I'm just going to, I've written a short introduction I'm going to read to you. So I had the good fortune to be part of a completely unique project with Ann Hamilton in Laos called Quiet in the Land. And there, under the curatorship of Franz Morin, who's here tonight, and in collaboration with local architects and builders, Anne designed and had built a meditation boat for local Buddhist monks and nuns, a place of respite on the Mekong where they could meditate away from the increasingly madding crowds of Luang Prabang. It was there in Laos that I had the opportunity to observe close up how Ann Hamilton, an artist who works in site specificity often, immerses herself completely in the place of her production. She calls herself a maker, someone who creates for the location of the body in relationship to the collective, and for the collective in relationship to its history, place, and location. It is not surprising that she studied geology and literature, or that her first degree was in textile design, or that she reads voraciously and widely. The words gesture, performance, erasure, repetition, sedimentation, weaving, all appear and reappear in discussions about her work. She loves language and the layering of meaning, the creation of metaphoric, metonymic, and symbolic universes. She talks about being alone together, about attention, about empathy, about making by hand. The work is always layered, spectacular in its accomplishment, often a bit enigmatic and complex in its execution, yet as meticulous as this making is, as audience, we do not focus on the mechanics of the installations, although they are often quite elaborate and even a feat in terms of engineering, because we are too immersed in an experience, taking it all in through our physical and psychic bodies slowly. Ann Hamilton has represented the US at the Venice, Sao Paulo, Istanbul Biennales. She has created intense installations at SF MoCA, Mass MoCA, the Guggenheim, the Hirshhorn, the Pulitzer, the Stedelijk, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Dia Foundation, and so forth. Not to mention the unforgettable swings at the Armory Drill Hall in New York called The Event of a Thread, a phrase taken from the writings of Bauhaus's Annie Albers. The Event of a Thread was probably the most popular installation in that space to date. A weaver of materials and meaning through texture and movement, she has collaborated with choreographer Meredith Monk and director Anne Bogart and the City Company. She has received numerous awards, the MacArthur, the Guggenheim, the Skowhegan Medal for Sculpture, and the National Medal of Arts given to her by President Obama, the highest honor offered by this country. She is a distinguished university professor at Ohio State University. She has stayed close to her roots and to her family. And most recently, using text from the Declaration of Independence and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, she has embedded the foundational words of US society into the walls of Manhattan's rebuilt World Trade Center, Cortlandt Street subway station on the One Line. This station, demolished on September 11, 2001, when floors of debris crashed into its roof, has finally reopened this year, encircled in white glass mosaic marble tile. It is a feat and a triumph. It is beautiful. Here's the language of freedom, justice, and the aspiration of democracy woven into its walls and built into the structure of this station that has been destroyed by catastrophic, unforgettable events. How do you transform rubble, rebuild, regenerate, reimagine? These are all concepts that can easily accompany her work. In a New York Times interview about Horus, her name for the Cortlandt Street subway installation, she said, quote, "The station is in the ground. The ground is the underlayment, the place where we prepare for everything we build above. What are the documents that are the underlayment for our civic aspirations, the ones that have been collectively authored and collectively held?" Ann Hamilton does not shy away from such basic, difficult, and profound questions, nor from the opportunity for joy. We are really thrilled to have her with us tonight, so please welcome Ann Hamilton.
Oh, thank you. Those beautiful words. And thank you everyone for being here. I know it's the end of the semester and everybody's really feeling the pressure. That was so nice.
So, I heard it for you.
This that you're seeing is, I've been thinking about what are my questions now? How do I prepare to stand here today? And what are the words I need? And that we're in this middle of this such a complex moment of listening and speaking. And how do we listen to what's going on and where we find ourselves, and also what are the words that need saying and how do we find the form for their saying. And it takes one back to maybe like the very beginning of where articulation comes from. And for me, it really, as Carol said, my first hand is a textile hand. It's a sewing hand. And in some ways, the simple act of stitching a cloth, of bringing into relation two things that were once separate is perhaps one of the most profound forms of making. And I know that I grew up listening to my grandmother read to me as we knit or sewed. And she had a distinct ability to do both at the same time. And the thing for me about sewing is not just that two things that were separate are brought into relation, but that it has the intimacy of the lap and the immediacy of the body, and that when you're sewing and you have a needle with a thread in your hand, it's in the immediacy of everything that is present in the space between you and the thing on your lap. But when you stick that needle down into the space below, you're sticking it down into a space that you can't see. This is supposed to repeat. There we go. And so from that invisible, almost really infinite space that could be thought of as greater than the reach of one's hand, you draw up from underneath the thing you can't see. And then you bring it into the present. And I think that, for me, that so much speaks to what the act of making is, that you cast yourself into something that you don't yet know. And you try to bring it up to shared experience, to felt form, to something that can be recognized and can become social at some level. And so, it's interesting that, like, when I applied to graduate school, which is now obviously many years ago, I can remember being asked in a very particular way, you don't do this weaving stuff anymore, do you? And how long it takes to return to your first hand when things in the culture are pushing against you trusting that, and that so much of making is really an act of faith and of trust. It's also like putting a talk together, because I have to like dip that needle in and think about what strand of work do I want to bring forward with this question about language and listening right now. And I do know that the textile thinking and the literal processes of textiles have been the underlayment of almost everything I've done, even if I'm not literally now at a loom. And that I think for me, the act of knitting, the act of one thread coming up and looping around and being drawn through another, is a kind of an act of democracy. Like, each loop has to hold and be in place in unison with the others to create the cloth. And so that kind of, in fact, you can have all sorts of patterns, but there's an egalitarian way that each part does it, carries its work. I've also thought about it as the way in which acts of textiles, a thread actually connects people, and the vocabulary that we use to associate to cloth are the metaphors we use to talk about many of our social relationships, obviously the web being one of them. There's a really fabulous book, where am I going? If anyone's interested, called The Craft of Zeus, and it traces all the way in which textile acts actually become, they cement and they materially come to symbolize social relations or to heal divisions in culture. It's a really good book. rush out. So in this project, which was in Toronto a long time ago called, I don't know what year, early 90s, Around, in a former power station that had been transformed into a cultural space, the skein of yarn actually becomes a divide in the space. And over the process of the exhibition of the work, which is a room surrounded by Greek wrestling dummies stuffed with sawdust that really have all the weight of the body. Each one weighed about, I think, 125 pounds, and it became a room that absorbed the sound so that you could hear the knitting of the needles and the movement of the needles of the woman, or not always a woman, but the person who was unknitting the divide in the space and knitting it into a surround that was the circumference of each of the wrestling dummies that were on the wall. So this process of attending to a project or the ongoing act that transforms the materials in a work is something that has been really present in a lot of the work. I think it's a way for me to bring that attention of making into the public and social life of a work. And it may also be that I just never know when to finish. But text, obviously the word text is a part of the word textiles, and so their incessant, what I think of as their incessant linearity of a thread, are connected both in our process of writing and reading and of stitching together. And I feel like so much of the task of the work has, or so much of the work has really been an exploration of how we know things through our every sense of our body being alert to feeling what is going on, and our ability to form language and draw that forward in a way that makes us social creatures. So this thread you see being pulled from my mouth is actually my first ball of hand-spun yarn from years ago. So the page and the body have always been inextricably linked for me in how I approach and think about them as tactile presences and as something to be read. So I'm going to show you two projects that are very early on. This one that was in Charleston called Indigo Blue, and the project I did at DIA called Tropos, partly because what structured the presence in this piece were acts of erasure. And as I stuck my needle down and started to organize this talk the last couple of days, I was thinking about that sometimes it takes 20 years to walk across the room, but what I'm seeing in the work and what I hope to trace for you tonight and share is this movement from the way erasure, which is an unmaking and a making, has more recently been focused in a real concern with composition and articulation. So in this project, which was in Charleston, we accumulated, what you see is an enormous pile of blue work clothing. Indigo Blue was the first cash crop developed by Elijah and Pinckney in Charleston. And it's a city that markets a very particular story of its past as a major tourist economy. And I was thinking about felt knowledge and the ability of materials to embody the things that have been difficult to say. And so this was in a part of a site project that Mary Jane Jacob organized, and in front of this big pile that really engulfed your vision when you walked in was a person who was sitting erasing books on a table. So they were using their own saliva, a pink pearl eraser, and they were erasing books from the back to the front. And it was like this remarking of, it's like marking of the body. And what that was erasing were books that were published by the Navy to talk about and determine that the legal boundary between the water and the shore, this in-between space, which is really where all experience lies. And this is what they look like. And each page, obviously, each book had the hand of a different reader, eraser. And these are then in many ways, the artifacts of the project. But the pile was erected out of acts of care. So I don't have the early video from this, but I was thinking about how this making room in the text for the history of the body, while the pile makes present the literal bodies that have not been emphasized, of work that has not been emphasized in the history. So what you saw, I see in the piles, a layer of shirts, a layer of pants, a layer of shirts. They were laid out as if each combination is a body. And so the act of that is soothing, touching, laying out, honoring. And in the face of that is this kind of erasure. So now I'm going to give you another book reference. This one is not published yet, but I have an early copy because it's written by a friend. But it's called A Primer for Forgetting by Lewis Hyde, and many of you might be familiar with his work, The Gift. Hi, Lisa. And his work on the trickster and the view of the artist as a trickster. He's made a very beautiful new book that, I don't know if I'm allowed to make this advance announcement. Are we recording this? But go on his website and you'll see this relationship between forgetting and remembering, and the necessity in some cases and the nuanced need for some things to come to remembrance, to be forgotten so that culture can move forward. It's very, very beautiful and I think necessary book right now. So next fall, Carol, bring him here to talk. But this act of care structures a lot of the making of the work and comes from my textile hand. The other very related project a couple of years later is this one that was at DIA. And this negotiation for me of what we know as the air and the smell and the light and the experience of what is underfoot comes up into consciousness. And in this piece, it was a shaped floor. It was not a totally level floor, covered in the stitched hair of horse tails. And there was a person reading, and reading is very much a physical act in a lot of my pieces. And but reading with a hot stylus, so that as the books were read, they became smoke. They were absorbed by the material of the hairs. Absorbs the smell of the smoke, and there's this material transformation. And outside the windows, which we shifted from being completely transparent to semi-opaque, so they let light in but no view, is a voice of an actor that I worked with who had dysphagia. And you hear his attempt to come to speech, but not a narrative. And this way that we privilege language over other forms of experience is very much something that I'm asking at this moment. And maybe with this talk, as I have tried to find forms to actually come to language myself in the work. Hair obviously holds memory. It holds bodily memory. It's a relationship of the human and the animal. And here, oops, this should play. Okay. It's just a little what that act actually is of reading at the pace of the singeing tool. My son, who was learning to read at the time, later, a number of years later, when he saw this, was like, "What is this?" And I said, "This is how some people read." But these are what these books look like. And I think that this is something I'm really questioning right now. I'm thinking about so this erasure is, I thought about as a clearing of a space, like clearing of a space for something else to happen. And now it feels so important in a different way to find the words that we need to fill that space. And so as I move towards actually talking about the subway and that process, I want to draw on some of the projects that I think have tried to address that. I actually do have some notes, but I don't know if I can actually read them. I'd also, like, in this question of what we know through all our feeling, I'm thinking a lot about in the discussions around a lot of art, you don't have that word, you don't use that word feeling a lot. I think you used it in your introduction, Carol. But, and when I was coming up on the subway, I was thinking about that because I was sitting on the seat and there was a woman who just was fine in front of me, and then all of a sudden she was completely taken over with grief and was sobbing. And I didn't know what to do, like to stand up and please take my seat, and someone who could not speak. And I was thinking about how hard it is for us to trust, in many ways, our feelings and the articulateness of our feelings, even as they might erase language. And then I was thinking about Descartes and the mind-body split, that even though we know experientially, it's still that sort of hierarchy of values, and that split is still alive in many ways in the culture. Even with all that we know from George Lakoff and Mark Johnson and neuroscience and stuff in the building next door. I was also thinking about how in the 17th century, there was this moment of constant warfare, and so reason and fact were something that were seen, something that could be testable, was something that actually brought in democracy and brought in a whole, obviously, other era of history. And in some ways how it sort of paved a way for consensus and some sort of belief in progress. And how we're in this moment where there's a lot of emotion. So if that was a time where it was really necessary to divide in some ways emotion from rationality or fact, then we're at this moment where emotion, so much of it negative, is really occupying so many of our spaces and our relations. And how do we begin to address that? And how are we motivated by our felt and our experiences? So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about that. But on the way, I want to pause and talk about this project that was in Venice at in 1999 at the Venice Biennial in the American Pavilion. And I think this was really where the beginning of my question was, what words do we need to bring forward now, and what is their form? And I worked with these 2 volumes of Charles Reznikoff's book, Testimony, as you can see here. And they were poems written, or recitative that was written at, I think in the 30s he was writing, and he was writing based on court records of racial and property violence at the turn of the century. So 100 years before I'm working in Venice making this work, thinking about that legacy. And we translated that into Braille. And it ended up then really coating the walls of the interior of the pavilion, which we had built a glass wall in front of, so it distorted the solidity of this architecture, which is obviously a demonstration of authority and state power. And inside, filled it with light. The skylights have been covered over for about several decades, and sifted a kind of toxic fuchsia powder from the edges over this Braille text. So you could and I'm thinking a lot about how the histories in a culture continue to haunt the present, even though we can't always grab them. And this powder was so fine, in fact, that it didn't stick. And that was actually one of its qualities. So there was a real sense of illegibility, except for a voice that circled the exterior, that if you followed its coded speaking, spelled out part of the second inaugural address of Abraham Lincoln. So a piece very much addressed to American history and erasures, and marked by the people in Venice, as also the powder really traipsed all over the city. Formless, kind of had a form that the thinking really about the way American culture has traveled. That's a longer discussion, obviously. So, and then I was thinking about the voice in that project, which I thought I had video, but I didn't hear it, so I think it must have dropped out. But the thinking about those articulations that are not necessarily language, but that call to our feeling. And I had the amazing opportunity of working with Meredith Monk, whose work, whose voice, whose practice, always when I hear it, feels like it just draws every pore on my body to attention. And she opened this project that I built in California. This is a tower that I built with Steve Oliver. And it's kind of an amazing story how this came to be. But I was thinking about how the opportunity of the invitation to do something on someone's property, which is private, now it's been gifted to the Sonoma Foundation, how I might share the conditions that have been made for me to work in architecture with other artists. And so I was thinking a lot about the relationship between a spectator or an audience and a vocalist or a performer. And so what had been spatialized in my work, as the work has grown to meet different kinds of architectures and different social histories, for the first time I was able to actually build a condition. And in this condition, it's a double helical staircase. It means that the audience and the performers can actually circle and be spatially wound within each other. I thought of it as a throat for the property, as a vocal cord. And my agreement with Steve is that he will continue, and I'll work with him to continue to commission work by other artists to work there. It doesn't rise above the horizon, it rises from a draw in the land to meet the horizon. And at the time, I was also revisiting an early essay by the amazing Anne Carson, where she talks, it's called The Gender of Sound. And it's in an early collection. I think it's maybe in her first published book. And she talks in there about how in Greek culture that women's vocal traditions were not language-based, and they were not allowed inside the polis, and that the practice of that was always outside at the perimeter. And another book reference. We're in a university, right? And maybe just a note to say partly that the reading that I do is, it doesn't explain the work, but I think what it does is it makes a landscape of permission for me to make the work. And so much of making work is sometimes finding the things that I need to be reading to help me recognize the questions that I have, and to trust not knowing. This is obviously Meredith. She's like, you could turn it up a little bit, because she's so amazing. She's playing a shruti at the bottom. And sound is also how we touch at a distance. So the tactile nature of everything that I've done materially is expanded by the experiences of working with artists like Meredith, whose work is voice and sound and vibration, which is really what makes up the world. So one of the things just to note is about the tower is that it doesn't really have a door. And I thought about it as an interior space, and the way, and that when you come in, that you have to kind of break in, so you have to go sideways to go up or down. And so if you go, there are so many steps down to the well, which reflects the sky, and then so many steps up. And physically what happens as you walk up the steps is that you're compressed towards the wall. So the steps start out at 6 feet of width, and then every step as you go up is just slightly shorter. So as you ascend towards light, you actually are compressed against the wall. And so there's this kind of inverse, very subtle shift as you go up and then back down into the ground. So coming towards the words, articulate words, words that are legible, actually becoming part of the work. That's really been a long process. And I think that I had to do a lot of listening and a lot of thinking about or reflecting upon my experiences, also being in places where you're communicating but you don't share language. And so this is the project that Carol referred to that was in the Luang Prabang. This is an early drawing for the boat. And here's what it looked like when it was finished and on the Mekong. And this is a good, Franz, will you just raise your hand that you're here? This person in the front row, Franz, really made the condition for this to happen. And all of this work, none of the work I do would happen if there weren't the people that I call the condition makers, who do the fundraising, make the structure, break all the rules, go with you on the collaborative journey and conversation that every project is. And this is really one of them. For almost 4 years were we in and out of, or I was in and out of Luang Prabang with you. And the challenge that Franz gave us in this project, part of the Quiet in the Land, is to make something both for here and for there. Not to just parachute in, not to be part of what was the beginning of the art fair, parachuting into one culture for 3 days and leaving, but to come and explore what it might mean to take a relation. So I was one of, how many artists? 12 artists who spent time there, and then was thinking, was very, very affected by the witnessing the pressures of the on the market, the pressures on the historic city and on the traditional culture, and particularly the loss of the support for the Sangha and the community's ability to take care of its Buddhist temples. And also the suppression of the history and the attempt by one monk, Sachuan Keto, to reinvigorate and teach young people in that tradition. And so we built a boat for walking meditation based on historic structures that we found, one in ruin and one reconstructed in the woods, and this is what it looked like. And this would be a whole lecture in and of itself, but what I wanted to do was show you one of its many blessings by the community. But sometimes you have to go very far out of your culture to actually find where you are. And I spent a day with the lay women. What are they called? The nuns, the lay nuns, sorry. I know they're not lay monks. How they taught me, I think, another form of listening. So the whole project was to actually not bring this back, but obviously to leave it, and it's there now on the Mekong. But it was a complicated conversation because Satu Ankeo said to Franz, a gift is not a gift if it has conditions. So if it has to just be used for the meditation, this is no gift, right? And then for us to figure out how there are no conditions. This is for you to use as you want. And then the exchange of legal documents, and I wish I had a picture of them in this slide. I don't. I had a sheaf of papers that Franz sent me back to Laos with from the nonprofit's legal structure here in this country. And I exchanged that. I signed it and exchanged it with Satonke for a single piece of paper with a wax seal and 10 words on it, which tells you everything about the culture. And then I had to borrow it back from him to actually be able to leave. And in borrowing it back for him, we invited for one evening on the Mekong at sunset to join this boat of silence to this boat of sound. And if we turn it up, you can listen to the court musicians whose practice had also been very suppressed, have been suppressed under the communist regime, playing their traditional music, tethered and pulled by the boat of silence. And for me, this is the piece, this moment. All that construction, 4 years up and down the muddy slopes. As Franz said, if she'd known what she was getting into, maybe we never would have built it. But every project is really kind of like that. And so what for me is really partly important is that it's there, and it's being used in all sorts of ways. Friends have sent me snapshots, and we continue to be involved in some way. But thinking about the attention and the act of walking actually comes background in the work to the way I've used a concordance as a spine of words that one walks to structure a text. And so it's in some strange way from this boat and the silence of it that I now come to the articulation part. And so concordance is just a way that one document is crossed with itself traditionally. So I think many of them are for the Bible or for famous pieces of literature. So how many times does the word read occur in a text, or the word of? And each one of those is accounted. So it's organized by the occurrence of those words and then the accompanying text either side of it. And I became really interested in how this organizes in a non-narrative way a piece of literature or a text, but also how that spine is like a body in space, and also how that spine is maybe very particular to the subjective experience of how each person might cross with the text. Because I know you all read, everybody in this room is in some ways a reader, and how when you're reading you come across these phrases and these words that you're like, I have to read this to somebody. You're compelled to share. But it's really a very subjective selection. And I've been thinking, like, what's a form for sharing that? And that's an ongoing question, that thing that's based on all of these contingencies of the page and your attention and your own subjective interior life. And yet you're touched, and it's a form of touch. And how do you bring form to that? So this is one way for me to think about that. I don't know that it does it. And we did a series for a project at the Pulitzer Foundation, of which this was a small part. We printed newspapers weekly, and the spine words had to do with what was going on in the piece in some ways, and I composed those. But it was crossed with the international news of the day. So I was thinking about, all our experiences, that relationship between the interior and the exterior, meeting, in this case, the exterior of the international news. And they took a couple of different structures. They were not printed, in fact, by a newspaper. Oh, I thought I had 2 of them here. But were hand silk screened on newsprint. And we sold them for a nickel, I think, inside the project. But it's interesting, the minute you charge, people don't want them. It's like, so I have a lot of them in my studio. 5 cents, I guess if it had been $500, maybe it would have been more attractive. And so then that structure became a way to think about actually working not on the page but in a space. And so I was invited to do a project at the library in Ohio State where I teach, and they were renovating the main library. And the center of that is a concordance, but it's not from the book that forms the horizontal. It's a spine of words that comes, and I wish it's cork, raised letters, and there. So it crosses a White River Sioux story about that the world stays in motion as long as the woman is weaving at her loom, making a porcupine coat. But every time she gets up to stir the fire for her food, the dog undoes the weaving. So it's a story that has many versions in the world. And so as long as she's working, the world will stay in motion. And so that crosses with two histories of the world. One, a Eurocentric story, an accounting by Gombrich that's a succession of events, and one by Galliano that is more from folk tales and from anonymous stories that tells the history of the world. It's much more, I think, political in a lot of ways and poetic. And they alternate every other line. And so as you walk across this, and I think you could maybe get a sense of that in that video. Here, let me get back to there. So I think every passage across this floor is, and it's in a reading room, whether you're sitting reading on it or you're walking across, is also an act of composition. So reading becomes an act of writing. And it's partly where your eye goes, where your attention is, what words catch you, and they're tactile, they're underfoot, they're not, they don't entangle you like that horsehair, but you definitely can feel their texture, and it's permanent, or relatively so. And there you can see the room and the context of the library, which is such an important cultural space. And then that brings us to the armory. How am I doing for time?
You're okay.
Okay? Okay. So, a civic space, like the library. And I'm going to kind of really take time to describe this because I love describing this project. And I was invited by Christy Edmonds, who, like France Morin, is one of the people I call the condition makers. And she was the one that initially set up the program, the arts programming at the Armory, filled all the empty spaces with artists, said, these are studios, we're going to get people in here working. And I began by thinking about, obviously, the history of the Armory. It's a whole city block in New York. It was built on a subscription by the community. It was built to house the militia, to protect the neighborhood. So in some ways, I look at this architecture and I say, this is something that was built out of fear. And so what does it mean to open that up? Or what does it mean to occupy that? And so I thought about that in relationship to the expression of intimacy. And if sound is how we touch at a distance, then might I read to the flock of pigeons as a way of reading to New York City? So we trained the pigeons, or we thought we did, to fly over a white cloth in a barn in Ohio to the sound of a school bell. We mailed them to New York City, which is the only carrier, legal carrier for the live birds. And they arrived like this. And this is what happens when you give a lecture. Like, all projects have all of these things behind it, these stories, but you don't ever get to talk about them. So I'm going to talk about it with this. So here they are. They're happy to be out of their cardboard boxes. The first test flight, they did not make it over the white cloth. And Rebecca Roberts, the director, said, "Anne, we just spent, I don't know how many dollars getting rid of the pigeons. Now they're loose in the building." She trusted, though. She so trusted every step. She was amazing. But a project starts really by walking it into my body. Like, so when I'm in a space or a place, then it has to come up through my feet. And I try to be as blank as possible, and I try to just pay attention to what comes to attention. because I know even if I don't, it seems inconsequential, I know that that's the seed that will actually make the project. So here's the space, which I'm sure many of you now know, and the piece that happened. It was in development for about 2 years, and it was the beginning of, I think, the place we find ourselves now in many ways, of this real sense of division and thinking about, I don't want to live in an us-them world. And if a cloth can be the mediation that connects people, how is that held by each hand? So the architecture offers this natural structure for swings. That was my first response when I saw the space, is to hang the swings. Because it's from 80 feet at the center. So that means you're very low on the pendulum, and so being on the swing is much more like flying than it is like this at the playground. And to make the seats all wide enough for 2 people, so they could be shared. But what's important is how those swings are tied to each other. And so in this project, as Carol said, the event of the thread, which links everything and is a phrase that comes from Annie Albert's description. Each of these swings is connected through the center membrane of the cloth to the swing on the other side. So you can see the person swinging opposite here in the image on the right. And the cloth itself is not held by the architecture, it's held by the swings. And so that means every body moving on a swing contributes to the turbulence and the breath of the cloth in the center. And the cloth raises and lowers, so you can see the person on the other side, and then it drops. And that's really the rhythm of it. The thing I learned so much from this project. I was there every single day it was open, and because there was so much to take care of. And is that when you get on the swing and something takes your weight, your heart falls open. I saw it happen again and again. Like, people were so kind to each other, and it became a little bit like an indoor park. It was really important to me that there was a place for everybody. There were benches that we built specially for around the perimeter. You didn't have to check your coat, you didn't have to leave your bag, but people are like leaving their bags all over the place, and it's like, where does that happen? Something was happening. So, and it was, I think, incredibly intuitive. For the act of getting on the swing was not something anyone had to tell you what or how to do it. I've done other projects not so successful where it needs a little instruction, and then I know they don't really completely work. When you need to be told, or you need to feel like, am I doing it right? So here's the landscape that it made, and this is the ghost swinging, in relationship to the person on the other side when no one's on that swing. As towards the end of the run, it got very crowded, and this is early on, and we were like, do you think people would get on the swings? We had no idea what would happen, but this is what happened. And I think, what's interesting is people just organized themselves to wait in line for the swings. There wasn't like anything institutional that had to happen to put any structure on that. That was a really important part of it. At the entrance to the space, there were, I can't remember how far this goes. Yeah, so the middle, which I knew was a divide, was also a joint, and people spent, they lay there. Well, actually, one day a little baby held on and started going up in the air. That was a little scary. But I got a note from people that got engaged. People laid next to total strangers, like touching, not in a theater seat, like on the ground, laying down. I thought that was really interesting. So when do we feel okay to make ourselves vulnerable in public space like that? And is the work partly about can we make that condition for people to be together? Okay, so at the entrance there were, these are either students of or members of City Company, and it was my first time working with them, and they helped really keep this. So every day there were a cruise of readers that read to the pigeons, and so the pigeons are in the cages here during the day, and they would settle down, and I swear they loved it. You know, there was something very calm about the voice reading and that kind of intimacy. And the readers were improvising with the scroll they were reading from and with each other. And what they were reading were concordance scrolls. I'm going to show you some of those texts. But what was important is in the microphone is that it was also a shortwave radio transmission. So the paper bags you saw in the video that are moving around the space have the receivers, and they vibrate a little bit. So the voice is being passed around among the audience, and we just recharged them every night. We thought, well, maybe people will take them. Nobody took them. We continued to do it. It started with Aristotle's De Anima, which talks about, in part, how the sense common to all species is touch. And it goes through, these are the texts that form the concordances. Very American. And there are the radios in the paper bags, lunch bags. One day, so we all have iPhones, but what is it that's magical about a paper bag with string? And one day this little girl's like, can I take this voice home? I saw people laying on the bench, like holding it to their chest, you know? So it was this way of touching at a distance. And as Carol said in the introduction, to think about how this makes a space to be alone together. So this has really changed the way I think a lot about the projects that I'm making. I mean, there aren't so many armories. Like, oh, I love your city block. And then at the other end, to go back to describing it, that what you saw here, if you were a reader, you got a merit badge every time you read. People were paid, but you also got a merit badge. And that's what those look like. This was a prolific reader. And then at the other end, there was a singular writer. So the retrospective or reflective act of writing frames the other end of the field of motion. And their only view of the room is through a mirror that's rotating and moving in response to the movement also of the swings in the cloth. And they're writing letters. And they're writing letters to qualities. Dear air, dear light, dear time, dear space. They're all airmail envelope letters. And their view, as you can see in the mirror, is there. But during the day, it was to Lexington Avenue. So it's the first time in the history of the Armory that there's been a view from the street into its interior. And that's something that, I don't know if it's happened so far, but Rebecca said that they're incorporating into the renovations. It's there. I see the nodding heads, yeah. And that was something that we never planned, but I knew it wasn't working. That delivery door opened up one day, 2 weeks before the opening. I'm like, that's the piece. That light has to come in. And it also has made me understand the way in which all my work orients itself towards light, which is something I had kind of had missed. And it's why it's actually been really hard for me to work in museums and galleries and spaces that they don't have light in them, or natural light. So at the end of the day, the pigeons never flew over the cloth. So we would carry them, and then they would be serenaded. And here we are. It's kind of like Vespers or something. And as they were serenaded, each night was a different vocalist singing a composition David Lang wrote for the pigeons. And this is Katie Geisinger, who works with Meredith Monk. But each night it was a different person. And as she's singing, we cut a record. So what you saw in the beginning of that video was the acetate record cutter. And so what happens when you cut a record is this very fine thread comes off that is the voice that's materialized. And I realized when we were making the piece, I didn't know this before we made it, but that is the event of the thread. And that's that spider thin material that comes from the voice is the piece. So we also, I don't have my watch, so I don't know how I'm doing for time. 7:30. So can I go a little bit longer?
Yeah.
Okay, 10 minutes? 10 minutes, okay. We made a newspaper. And partly this is where the writing starts. So I've had a lot of intense discussions about the nature of the didactic panels for projects. You know, what information do people need? How do you offer that? What is the vocabulary for that? Don't tell people what to think. People are really smart. And so for this project, we made a newspaper, and that's what you see reading. And it had images, but it also had writing that was very associatively linked to the elements in the project, but didn't actually talk about the project. So it talked about pigeon navigation, and it talked about cloth, and it talked about reading and writing, but it didn't say anything about the project, except in the thank yous and acknowledgments and stuff. And I loved how that also made a landscape for you to experience the piece without telling you what to think. And that then became something I'm trying to do for each project. But writing is, I think, one of the hardest things in the world. And I was lucky to have a residency with two extraordinary artists, Lynn Hickson and Matthew Gulish, based in Chicago. And Matthew, who's a really extraordinary artist, writer, performer, he's like, Anne, you have to write every day. And I'm like, oh, it's so hard. He's like, 4 hours. So every day is the first time someone forced me, or he didn't force me, but, invited me to that discipline. And what I wrote became the newspaper for the next project. And this is actually online, and you can download it if you're interested, but it was the same thing. So I expanded that idea of writing associationally in relationship to the elements in a project. And this was the project that was installed on the pier along the Delaware in Philadelphia in conjunction with the project at the Fabric Workshop. And thinking about the place of language and storytelling relative to the turbulent present. And so I'm just going to skip kind of forward to talk about where that language occurs. So deep in the pier, we had, we cleaned it up, but it was still full of detritus. And so there's a first half you can occupy as you walk through this field of motion, which is the curtains, and you get to a table where there was always someone present, and they were unmaking these sweaters. So I kind of returned to that vocabulary of the burning of the books in some way, and undoing that knitting. But in front of them was a poem that I had asked Susan Stewart to work on for the condition of the river, the pier, but the condition of reading continuously as a line. And, oh, this video's really bad. I think I have, okay, so here you can see the form of the poem. And that poem as a projection and as at one point a performance which proceeded at the rate of the hands, reading at the rate of the hands moving. Tactilizing the text, here it is. Was between this unmaking of the sweater and the spinning of raw wool into thread. And thinking about, and I'll show you those pictures, how this act of making is the first storyteller. And right now, what we need more than any are those first storytellers. And although this thread, this hand-spun, spindle-spun thread does not have language in it, it's the act of the first teller of stories. And that sat just outside the space behind a net fence in with all the garbage from the pier that is still there, and is both a past and a kind of future, was how I thought about it. And so trying to understand that is really very much where I am right now. The swings function, or the swings, the curtains turn because you pull bell ropes. This wasn't as intuitive as the swings. And what I learned is that, we're all born, even when we're fetuses, our hands are like this. The first thing we know how to do is grip and grasp, but you have to learn to let go. And you can't tie your shoes until you learn to let go. And so in this piece, when you pull these bell ropes, which come from change ringing, which is a tradition of, in the bell towers, of unison sounding, is that to get the curtains to move, you have to pull and let go, and pull and let go, and how that gesture, understanding that in your body, is part of actually this piece working. So just to finish with 9/11, not with 9/11, but with the subway. This is this giving form to my question about what words need to be present now and in what form. So this is what the subway, the former Cortlandt station, looked like after 9/11. And for a lot of different reasons, it's taken all of 17 years for it to open. And it was partly because also the structure around it had to completely be rebuilt. It also had to do with politics and agencies and coming to agreement. But I worked with an amazing woman, Sandra Bloodworth, at the MTA, who's head of the Arts and Transit program. And she'd been working on this station for, I think, a total of 17 years. I was only the last 4 of those years. It had several different plans. But how do you make out of that kind of unmaking? And I only had a month to come up with a proposal. They invited people to make proposals. I'm like, a month? But when I did the site visit and I walked it, I kind of knew immediately what I felt like I needed to do. It was like some projects you're putting your head against the wall. Some projects are gifts. And this was a gift. And it just arrived almost fully formed. So what I proposed was the project had to be mosaic, but it's the first time they've agreed to let that mosaic be stone and not glass. And that took 2 years of negotiations, actually. And it was also the first time they've ever allowed a piece that's all text to actually be part of the Subway Commission projects. And here you're seeing it just being finished. And so it's white marble that it has both an international and national in source, and it's structured by spines of words that on the southbound, and I'm going to show you each one of those, go along its length and are taken from the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. You know those words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are next, are created equal, with certain unalienable rights. These are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights is the right of the people. This is not continuously lifted I've taken those phrases from the document, and in the horizontal, and on the northbound side is the occurrence of the word everyone, flanking the entrance to the Oculus and the Calatrava space from the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's not a legally binding document, but it's the document that was crafted in 1948 at the end of the Second World War, when the world was obviously in trauma and recovery. And Eleanor Roosevelt, the amazing Eleanor Roosevelt, chaired that committee. And miraculously, it was signed by almost every signature, all but a few, of the UN at the time. So it has been the basis, that document has been the basis of all human rights documents since. And some of those have taken 10, 15 years to find agreement internationally. The word rights has been especially difficult. There's a lot of obviously controversy in the culture, like what is the responsibility of government to its people? And I know by talking to someone who's in international law and teaches at Georgetown, she's saying increasingly in international negotiations, they talk about responsibilities, not necessarily rights. That if you can talk about what the responsibilities are, that actually can bring more agreement to the table. And so I think now a lot about, well, what is our responsibility as artists to this moment? To be mirrors, to try to articulate and make whatever recognitions we might have possible, shareable, and touchable. So, thank you.
Do you want to take a few questions?
I love questions. Are there any questions? I'm sure there are a few. Let's see. Yes?
Do we need the mic, or can I just?
I think somebody got one there, but yeah.
Thank you for that amazing talk. I had a question about how you document the projects that are not permanent installations. Is that just something that comes about, or is there a way that you attempt to curate it?
It's so complex. It's a whole nother project. It's a whole nother project. And it isn't even until you go to like make a talk where you're like, oh, like I don't have that. Because you're so focused on the project and its life, and it's like taking care of it and being in public with it or whatever, and then it has to live in this other form. So I have worked extensively with a photographer who was based partly in New York and is now based in Paris, Thibaut Jensen. And I started working with him at DIA because the book designer actually asked to see photographic portfolios from an agent that she knew. And in the portfolio was an image from Uppsala, Sweden, and Linnaeus' summer garden. And I had seen those pictures in a magazine, and it had made me take a train from Stockholm to see that place. I'm like, okay, this is the guy. And what I found in his work is I felt like he might not get all the description, but he got the feeling. And so it's like I've been really focused on the felt quality of it. Is there a way that the photograph can hold some aspect of that? But some former students did the video for the project at the Armory, and for a long time I didn't video things. I don't know what I was thinking. And that is increasingly important, but I haven't had the budgets really. You bottom out the budget totally just to make the project, and then I wish we had a film crew at the Armory in the sense that there were so many things going on in the conversations with people, not only in the space, but also like printing the concordances every night and the conversations with the readers and the writers and what they were experiencing. And the women in the third floor shelter who came down and would swing and working with them, it had such a life. And that problem seems to have boiled down into a few photographs in the end, sometimes two, but then I think about it and I go like, well, the memory is held in people. It really is. And I'll run into people that I don't necessarily know, and they're like, I have this on my phone, and I think I have such conflicted feelings about what should survive and in what form, because are you just making a big make-work project for somebody to take care of this? Because they're they require a lot of care. So anyway, yeah, that's ongoing problem. Incomplete. Yes. Oh, yeah, and then behind you. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pam. They're beautiful. They're just wonderful. Going back to the swing, was one of your intentions about speaking to the permanence of, and the lack of permanence, and the randomness of a city space, of a city block, in which it will never be repeated again? And it manifested itself in the beauty of the cloud, in the way in which you were taking the energy that was imported by the swing, and you walk down a street in a block, it's never the same.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and you know, it's like everywhere you're walking down the street, and then there's a way that total strangers acknowledge each other, right? Like there's a glance, or there's like, but you don't say anything, you don't touch the person, right? But it's like there's some sort of recognition or acknowledgement, and it can totally change your day, you know, especially if it's positive. and I think that, you know, in many ways it's like the form of the works change, but it's like I'm trying to make a condition for attention, and for people to occupy their own associative space with it, and not to like have my experience of what I think it's doing, but to maybe occupy a spaciousness in themselves of attention. And I don't know that the work can do any more than that, but can it return you to yourself in some way? So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I listened to your podcast that you did with Krista Tippett.
Oh, yeah.
Sort of religiously whenever I'm having a tough time in the studio.
You do?
Yeah. So thank you for that. I always found like this kind of sublime quality to your work. It's always like very beautiful yet fragile, and it really connects with something that kind of makes me feel warm inside. But sort of seeing the project where you were kind of burning out words, there's like a real kind of violence in that, that I don't think I ever sort of paid attention to when thinking about Anne Hamilton's work. So I was curious if you could probably speak about that gesture.
Yeah, sure. Good question. I mean, I like that you're listening to that, or finding some permission. You know, I think that's what, as artists, we need to do for each other, is to help extend permission for you to do what you need to do. So the burning of the book, that's so how I thought about it is also time. You know, we're here, and then that time is gone. And so, but obviously the burning of books is the destruction of culture. So there were people that, you know, obviously had a lot of, really grilled me on that at the time, and I was like, well, there's 500,000 copies of this book in circulation. And this is an emblematic kind of act. And I think that it was, for me, in many ways, about the fragility of actually holding on. But, you know, I'm not doing that kind of erasing. The reason I put the sweaters in from Philadelphia, I didn't fully go into that project, but was because it was the first time in some way I returned to that kind of real unmaking. And these holes, because I'm thinking about how does it make a space for something else to happen? And we're at this moment where it feels like we need to figure out how to make this space, this hole in the cloth, for something else to happen. And so I think for me, my thinking's tied up with that. Yeah. But the other thing is, you know, the pages are actually incredibly beautiful. And what they carry is they actually carry each person's hand. So each book is very different. So each of the readers in that project had their own book that they chose to read, because I was like, you should be reading something you want to read. And we chose them so they didn't have any chapter headings or title pages, or titles printed on the top stylistically, because I didn't want that particular book to dominate how someone might experience the work. So they all came from the Strand, secondhand, and we went and bought 100 books, and people could choose what they wanted to read. So it's a form of reading. Yeah, behind you.
I really loved your description of sewing at the very beginning. It's like the sheet between the known and the unknown. And I thought that was maybe a really good description of reading as well.
Yeah.
And of course, sewing is labor. And I was wondering if you think about reading as labor in any kind of way, or just your thoughts about labor in your work.
Relative to reading, I think the thing that's so, I just did a project with Anne Bogart was based on reading of Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse. And we weren't working with the narrative of that book so much, which is extraordinary, but we were thinking about the condition of reading, and that when you read, it's kind of like the near and the far, so like it's the immediacy of the room that you're in, and the kettle going off and the phone ringing or whatever, and the immersion at the same time in the far away that is in that book, and our ability to hold those two simultaneous spaces. I also think about how when I read, I feel like I'm restored. Something about the silence of reading, the act of finding that reading is. So I've been thinking a lot about how, some books are a labor to read. My husband teases me because he's like, you don't ever underline the main points. When he looks at my books, I'm like, yes, I do. Because I'm so often reading for language. And sometimes not for argument or, it's like the felt quality of those two words that sit on the page together that reach out and touch. And I think, part of what was behind this Virginia Woolf piece with Anne was like, well, can you share that? Can you share that? And can that thing that's so singular, can it be collectively held in any way? And I also think, like, in terms of labor, I love to work, but it's how I think. It's like that, I've been reading a lot of things in anthropology recently that talk about, like the touching of materials is this form of thinking. And it's like, if I'm just like sitting there in my head, it's all over. Really, like that I like to be in motion, to be in contact, to be responding and not reacting. That's like to try to keep one's practice in that space. That's what I think about. You can pass the microphone down. Do we take a few more? Yeah.
I was very, very struck and very moved by your description of how in the Armory, and you mentioned that you do this with other works as well, how you grounded yourself in your feet and you walked in the space and allowed things to sort of come in. And I wondered if that was a practice that came naturally to you, or whether you could speak a little bit more about that.
I think it's a form of listening. I think work has to come from listening, and it's like that listening has to happen all along the way. So, but it's like sitting, being in motion, walking a place, being silent. Those are all ways projects start. And I think the worst projects I've made is when I haven't had time for that experience. So I'm working out of, my body doesn't have the information it needs to make a work. And so it's just something I know. I also, when you're doing it though, it feels like nothing's happening. It's like, like nothing's coming in here. But what comes in is all you have. And so you have to think that you have to pay attention to it. And you know, one of the things, like at the Armory, I spent some time up in the archive. Most of the stuff is at the Historical Society, but they have some photographs and things in a small collection of things. And I think I started looking at those photographs, thinking about the drill hall and the how it was used, and the summer practices of the men that were in the 7th Regiment there. And what I saw in these photographs was tenderness, and men touching each other, and this camaraderie that felt incredibly tender and didn't have any of the associations to the military that I thought I was going to find in those photographs. I mean, it's there in the clothing, but not in the gestures of the people. And I think that then had a whole lot to do with how that project formed. That extended hand of the casualness, you know, two men next to each other, but like this hand of comfort. I can't remember what you asked, but yeah, so we're walking, yeah, one more.
Yeah, I remember being in the drill hall, and when you're in the drill hall in the swings, you'd be having your own experience, you'd be by yourself, and maybe you would realize you're affecting somebody else. And then in Philadelphia, I remember being there, and in there you could give the experience of being inside the things, or you could receive the experience. So it seemed like what I was thinking about saying is that in one of the projects you were there and swinging, and the condition you'd see, the condition you were creating for somebody else. But in Philly, it was much more specific and immediate. Yeah. Like people would be having fun. Like, I'm going to do this for you, and I would look at the person, and he would say, "Okay, I'm having this experience because you're pulling this really hard," and it was creating a sort of blissful cocoon for somebody else. So I was wondering if you could talk about how immediate that felt when you were creating that project. Like, did you realize that people were going to do that?
I think what happened in that project is that we opened as much as we could. The doors were all pretty broken, and we couldn't open the corrugated doors on the side very much, but as much as we could, we opened them to let the air. And so I really thought about it as this like human hand giving way to weather and the engulfment of that, and that what we're in control of is actually such a small thing. So I think it was true that like you couldn't stand inside the curtains and they're surrounded at the same time that obviously you were pulling them up and down. So there was a different kind of exchange.
Yeah, it was a giving and receiving sort of.
But the motion of the curtains themselves was also this like collaboration with the wind and the weather, and the turbulence in that room, or the stillness, had everything actually to do with the weather. Yeah. And so I think for me the social relationships were in relationship to
there's
the
different
weather.
Scales of the body relationship to her. Yeah. It was great.
So, yeah,
So much fun.
Yeah. So can I take one more? Right there, and then we'll be done. Yeah.
Thank you, Anne. Well, for my question is, like sometimes, as you mentioned, sometimes you need to go out of your culture to find where you are.
Yeah.
And do you isolate yourself preparing your like.
Do I isolate myself to prepare the work?
No, another word, the inspiration for your new works, or in another words, are the inspiration of your works is more being in a like new environment, or from being part of the new, like the old environment, like the new or the old is more.
That's an interesting question. I love that feeling when you go someplace you don't know, and especially if you have a project. You're not just a tourist, like, you know, I'm a terrible tourist, because like I need my work. But it's like you go and everything can be part of the project, everything, and it's so full of possibility, and you're just like, you know, and I think your attention is maybe greater to all these things when you're outside the familiar. So I spent, I think 6 weeks last summer in a small medieval town in Portugal. And we ended up weaving, connecting 5 institutions and the farmer's market and a community choir and a museum. And it was so much fun because I could go, well, the city's the project. But that's not what they asked me to do. But it's what it became. And it also forged new relationships, you know, for them. And so I think that thing about and yet the project's not about the place. It's more the possibilities that can come forward from how you recognize what's there. And it's very, very social. It's very conversational. And then you're super excited, and then you come home and you're like, oh, what was I thinking? Because then, you know, there's a lot of logistics and actually coming to form. Coming to form is really hard for your questions, to find form for your questions. So, thank you.